All right, so you've been hearing about all this Broadcom VMware stuff,
Yeah.
right? And specifically, the licensing challenges.
Yeah.
So you want the full story,
Yeah.
but you don't want to, like, drown in a sea of technical jargon. Well, that's what we're here for.
Exactly.
That's our deep dive. And we've got this guide called Navigating VMware Licensing Challenges After the Broadcom Acquisition in 2024. And it's wild. We're talking about businesses locked out of software they paid for, facing audits that they can't win,
Oh, yeah.
and even looking for entirely new platforms just to get away from this whole mess. So stick with us. And we'll break down what's happening, why it matters to you,
Yeah.
and what you can actually do about it.
Yeah, you know what's really remarkable is that almost a year after the acquisition, we're
Yeah.
still seeing all this fallout. And this guide, it really highlights how many businesses, especially those with smaller IT teams, are suddenly finding themselves in this position where their access is just revoked, even with prepaid multi-year licenses.
It's more than an inconvenience, though, right? The guide uses this analogy of buying a car,
Right.
and then the dealership changes hands, and the new owner says, hey, you need to reprove that you own this car before you can drive it. Oh, and by the way, your warranty, yeah, that's expiring, except this is your company's entire IT infrastructure.
Exactly. The stakes are so much higher.
Right.
And, the guide doesn't shy away from the real-world impact either. Companies, they're being denied crucial patches,
Yeah.
updates, which leaves their systems vulnerable. Imagine facing an audit, and you can't prove you're compliant because you're locked out of the system. You need to demonstrate it.
It was like a nightmare.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you've got Broadcom and previous vendors like Dell
Mm.
pointing fingers at each other.
Right.
So the people who sold you the software are now saying, not our problem.
It's a very frustrating situation, but the guide does offer some practical steps to try to navigate it. So step 1, prove you own the software.
Yep, that sounds simple enough.
You would think so,
Right.
but as the guide points out, if you used a managed service provider,
An MSP?
yeah, an MSP, things can get really complicated. Your license might actually be under their account, not yours.
So even if you have all your receipts, it might not even be enough.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to know exactly where your license is. The guide really stresses this. You have to find that original contract, your license keys, and especially your site ID.
Site ID. That sounds, I'm guessing that's more than just a random number.
Oh, it's crucial. It's like your golden ticket to Broadcom's support portal, the gateway to your software.
Got it.
Without it, you're stuck.
Okay, so getting through that portal is a breeze, I'm sure.
Perfect.
Okay.
The guide lays out the process. You have to submit a site access request through their portal. And even then, you might get denied or face major delays. And then you're stuck with phone calls, online chat support,
So bureaucratic labyrinth.
pretty much.
And what about those vendors, like Dell? Can they help at all?
That's step 3 in the guide. They might be able to assist, especially if they were managing your site ID. But there's a caveat here. The guide's pretty blunt about this. Some vendors now consider VMware outside their support scope because they don't directly profit from it anymore.
So good luck getting help with something that's not making them money.
Yeah,
It's cynical.
it is. But it's the reality of the situation. And the guide doesn't sugarcoat it, which is why it emphasizes step 4, finding interim solutions while you're stuck in this licensing limbo. And the key here is security.
Right. Because the last thing you need,
Yeah.
on top of a licensing nightmare, is a security breach.
So what are we talking about here? Duct tape and prayers?
Well, not quite.
Okay.
The guide suggests using any old patches or updates you might have backed up, increasing your system monitoring, basically anything to shore up your defenses while you wait for Broadcom to sort things out. It's all about minimizing your vulnerability. Okay, so we've got proving ownership, navigating the portal, calling in maybe helpful vendors, and battening down the hatches security-wise. What about a more assertive approach?
Huh?
The guide mentions legal action. Is that a viable option?
The guide actually advises caution there when it comes to legal action. Lawsuits, expensive, time-consuming, and in this case, could actually backfire by delaying things even further.
So not a quick fix.
Not at all.
More like a last resort, if all else fails. But are we really just stuck with this situation? Is there no way out?
Well, that's where things get interesting. The guide mentions that some companies are actually using this as a chance to completely rethink their whole virtualization setup. They're looking at alternatives like Proxmox, Hyper-V, XCPN.
Wow, so they're jumping ship entirely. It's a pretty bold move. I get the frustration. But isn't that a bit like throwing the baby out with the bathwater?
It might seem drastic, but it just goes to show how deeply this is impacting businesses. You know these alternatives. They might not be a perfect fit for everyone, but the fact that companies are even considering them, it really speaks volumes about the level of dissatisfaction out there.
It's almost like a wake-up call. Like, we've been relying on this one platform, and now the rules have changed. Makes you wonder, what other vulnerabilities are lurking out there?
It definitely raises questions about the long-term implications of this whole thing. And that's something the guide touches on as well. Okay, so let's say you've managed to navigate this immediate crisis. What steps can you take to protect yourself in the future?
Okay, long-term strategies. What does the guide recommend?
Well, it emphasizes proactive steps. And there are a few that I think are really relevant to our listeners. First and foremost, document everything.
Document everything. What do you mean by that?
Your license keys, your contracts, your site ID. Treat them like gold in this environment. Proving ownership is critical. Keep those documents safe, organized, and easy to find.
So create a paper trail. Have all your ducks in a row.
Exactly. And along those lines, the guide also stresses the importance of backing up your entitlement data. Keep copies of your patches, your updates, even your support conversations. That way, if Broadcom cuts off your access again, you're prepared.
Like an insurance policy for your software.
Exactly.
So documentation, backups, what else?
Well, if you're working with an MSP, the guide really emphasizes establishing clear agreements about who controls what when it comes to your VMware setup. Any ambiguity there is a recipe for disaster.
Don't leave anything open to interpretation.
Yeah.
Get it all in writing.
Absolutely. And finally, the guide emphasizes the importance of staying informed. This Broadcom VMware integration, it's still evolving, so expect more changes down the line. Keep an eye on those official announcements and any updates to their licensing policies.
So be proactive, be prepared, and maybe even be a bit skeptical.
Yeah.
This whole situation is messy.
It is.
There's no sugarcoating it. And it's not just a technical issue. It's about business continuity, security, and frankly, trust. We've covered the challenges, the steps you can take, and even some pretty radical alternatives. So what's your takeaway from all of this?
I think what's important to remember here is that this goes beyond just VMware. This raises questions about the entire tech landscape. What happens when software ownership becomes less important than having constant access, controlled by a few powerful companies?
That's a pretty unsettling thought. Are we headed toward a future where we're essentially renting our software instead of owning it?
It's a possibility that we need to consider. The guide focuses on navigating these immediate licensing challenges, but it also nudges us to think critically about the shift in digital ownership and control.
So where do we go from here? What's the next step for listeners who are grappling with this? Well, I think one of the key takeaways from this guide is that it's important to take action. We've talked about documenting your licenses, backing up your data, having those clear conversations with your MSPs, and staying informed about this whole situation. It sounds like knowledge is power here.
Oh, it absolutely is. And even if you're not directly affected by this specific situation right now, these trends, they're shaping the future of how we interact with technology. The more you understand, the better equipped you'll be
to navigate these complexities.
This whole conversation has really got me thinking about, the bigger picture. We're so used to owning software. But what happens when that ownership becomes more about access, controlled by these large corporations? It's almost like we're shifting from owning a house to renting an apartment. You're at the mercy of the landlord. Yeah, that's a great analogy. And it highlights the potential vulnerabilities here. We need to be asking ourselves, who really controls our digital lives? What happens when that control is concentrated in the hands of a few powerful companies?
It's a little unsettling.
It is.
But I guess that's the point of a deep dive like this, right?
Exactly.
To get us thinking about these broader implications.
We can't just bury our heads in the sand and hope things work themselves out. We need to be informed, engaged, and ready to advocate for our own digital rights.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this final thought. Don't just react to the headlines. Take some time to really understand what's going on here. Think critically about this shift towards access over ownership. And most importantly, don't be afraid to ask questions, demand answers.
Because at the end of the day, the future of technology is in our hands. Let's make sure we're shaping it in a way that benefits everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And remember, stay curious, stay informed, and stay empowered. Until next time.